Okay, here we are for the final part 3 of the video lecture for chapter 13. If you recall, at the end of the part 2 of this video lecture, we were talking about the effect of a single environmental variable, variation in a single environmental variable affecting the response of organisms. In other words, their competitive abilities were affected by, say, relative nutrient concentration or temperature or something like that. Up to this point, we had looked at just a single variable, environmental variable, and its effect on competitive abilities. But oftentimes, it's more complicated than that, as you might imagine. You can have multiple environmental factors interact to affect the response of organisms. For example, field studies of cordgrass species in New England salt marshes have shown this. Low marsh habitats are frequently flooded. They're closer to the tidal zone or whatever. High marsh habitats are less frequently flooded. And so you might expect as a result of that, you get changes along that gradient or that flooding gradient. You get changes in nutrient availability, changes in physical stress related to water logging, salinity, oxygen availability in soils and sediments. All sorts of things are affected by this gradient of flooding, essentially. So plant zonation actually follows those differences. There are two species of salt grasses that are found here. One is Spartina alterniflora, that's found in the low marshes, and then you have Spartina patens, which is found in high marshes. And so a number of experiments have been done with these two species along this gradient of flooding, and it turns out, generally speaking, these experiments, or the more notable ones, have involved transplanting, for example, S. patens to low marshes and S. alterniflora to high marshes. And so in one example, what they found, let me go ahead and go with that figure, is that S. patens was stunted with or without competition. It didn't matter if it was competing or not. If you moved it to another habitat, it didn't do well. S. alterniflora grew well in high marshes when it was transplanted there without competition, but when there was S. patens present, S. alterniflora was excluded in those high marsh habitats. So S. patens then seems to be limited to the high marsh. It cannot tolerate the environmental conditions in the low marsh, and S. alterniflora can live in both, but is excluded from the high marsh by S. patens. And so if we zoom in here a little bit, you can see here we have a profile, so a salt marsh profile from low marsh up to high marsh. And so you'd expect these areas here to be flooded or inundated more often. And this is salt water coming in through the tides, for example. And up here you have areas that are flooded less often. So this is our S. alterniflora zone. This is our S. patens zone. All right, so over here, you can see the results of this. So in graph B, this one, we have Spartina patens control and transplants. We have biomass measured as grams per 100 square centimeters of area. Okay, so we have our control in green. We have with competition biomass in yellow, and without competition biomass shown in blue. In low marsh, where S. patens is not normally found, it didn't do well whether competition was present or not. Okay, it didn't matter. So it seemed like environmental variables like soil oxygen content or salinity are probably affecting it. In the high marsh, where it's normally found, it does well in the control. It does well with competition between it and Spartina alterniflora, and it does well without competition. So it's the best competitor in its sort of native habitat. Now down here we have the same thing shown for Spartina alterniflora control and transplants. So in the low marsh, it does well because that's where it's adapted to. It does well in a control, it does well with competition and without. So with competition with S. patens and without. And then when it was transplanted to high marsh, the only way it did well is when S. patens wasn't present. When it was present, it outcompeted S. alterniflora. So again, S. patens then is limited to the high marsh. It can't tolerate the environmental conditions in the low marsh. alterniflora can live in both, but is excluded from the high marsh by competition through S. patens. All right. Another example of this very thing, we have 4 species of chipmunks that live on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And these 4 species have overlapping food requirements. Each lives in a different altitudinal zone. And so you have, for example, the highest altitudes, the alpine chipmunk. Then you have the lodgepole chipmunk going down, yellow pine chipmunk, and then the least chipmunk at the lowest elevations. So an important question to ask here is, what are the factors that determine the distribution of these 4 species? Well, the contact zones are determined in part by aggression between the species. The yellow pine chipmunk here is dominant over the least chipmunk, which you see living below it on the slopes. Okay. The least chipmunk can live in all of the habitats on the slope, but it's restricted to the sagebrush zone. Okay, it tolerates heat stress better than the other species, and at the lower elevations you have higher temperatures typically. And so the species of the 4, the one that is best adapted to tolerate heat stress, can probably do better in those conditions, and it certainly does. If the yellow pine chipmunk is removed, and that's what some of these studies have done, it turns out that the least chipmunk will move up into its habitat because it can survive there as well. So it's competition between the 2 that's keeping the least chipmunk at lower elevations. If the least chipmunk is removed, so we take the least chipmunk out, which some of these studies did, the yellow pine chipmunk will not move down into its habitat because its environmental conditions, the temperature basically keeping it up where it is, it does not tolerate heat stress nearly as well as the least chipmunk. Okay. All right, the lodgepole chipmunk is dominant over the yellow pine chipmunk. So here we have the lodgepole, it's dominant over the yellow pine, and that determines the upper range of the yellow pine chipmunk. The lodgepole chipmunk is susceptible to heat stress, so it only is found in the lodgepole pine shaded forest habitat. So up here you have forested habitat where you have a lot more shade. This guy is really susceptible to heat stress, much more so than yellow pine chipmunk, and so it has to stay up here in this more shaded, forested area. The lodgepole chipmunk, however, is extremely aggressive. It's the most aggressive of the 4, and that factor likely determines the lower range then of the alpine chipmunk. All right, so the range of each of these species is determined then by, in some cases, aggressive exclusion of one species over another, and its ability to survive and reproduce in the different environments. So it's a combination of environmental factors and interspecific direct competition through aggressive behavior, that sort of thing, that really determines the distribution of these 4 species along that altitudinal gradient. All right, so the ecological niche of a species is just simply the range of physical and chemical conditions where it can survive and reproduce. Okay, so we have something called the fundamental niche of a species. The fundamental niche is the ecological niche when there are no interactions with other species. So think of the fundamental niche as the total area that a species could inhabit if it was freed from competition with other species, if it didn't have to compete. So that being the case, it's sort of like a baseline. Question is, how can competition then restrict the fundamental niche of a species? Well, when you have a species that is not inhabiting its entire fundamental niche because of competition with other species, then it's inhabiting what's called its realized niche. Okay, this is the part of the fundamental niche that a species actually exploits or is capable of exploiting as a result of interactions with other species. It's going to be smaller than the fundamental niche. Competition can lead a species to restrict its use of resources such as space or food, and there have been a number of studies that have shown that the fundamental niche contracts when a competitor is present. All right, so if the fundamental niche contracts when a predator or a competitor, let's say, is present, what happens if that competitor suddenly vanishes, disappears, leaves. Or maybe the species in question migrates to a new area where the competitor is not present. Well, what happens then is a process called competitive release, or a phenomenon rather, called competitive release. It's the expansion of a species niche when a competitor is no longer present. So this can happen, for example, when a species invades a habitat that is free of potential competitors. It can happen when a species is removed from a community, allowing the remaining species to move into habitats that they couldn't occupy before because of the presence of that competitor. And this has been shown quite well through a number of different types of experiments. Some good examples of this. All plants and grasslands require light, water, and certain essential nutrients. All large mammalian herbivores in the grassland require plants to eat. So the question is, how can these competitors coexist in the same community? How different would two species have to be in their resource use to prevent competitive exclusion of one species over another? Well, observations of similar species living in the same habitat seem to suggest that they're able to coexist because they partition the available resources, okay? And this is a process, again, called resource partitioning. In other words, you have a variety of different resources that a species can use, but there are other competitors present with it in the same habitat that can also use those resources. So each species will sort of become specialized to use or utilize maybe a small piece of that overall resource pie, and maybe become specialized, very specialized on that and that alone. And so if they each start to specialize on their own particular unique aspect of the resource base, they can avoid competition. And that's what natural selection generally favors, is a reduction in competition through resource partitioning. So each species then uses a portion of the resource that's not being used by the other species that it exists with in that habitat. So field studies provide a number of examples that represent this resource partitioning. One with plants. A study was done with 3 species of annual plants that are grown together on prairie soil that was abandoned a year after a plowing. These species vertically partition the environment, resulting in different use of resources. And that's what you see here. So the 3 species then are bristly foxtail, you see over here on the right. This has a very fibrous, shallow root system, as you see there, to access a variable water supply. It recovers rapidly from drought, because you can imagine it's going to be exposed to drought probably more frequently than other species with longer and deeper roots. It takes up water quickly after rain, and it can photosynthesize even when it's partly wilted. All of those are adaptations to dealing with drought conditions. Indian mallow, the second one that you see here, has a very sparsely branched taproot, so sparsely branched up near the surface, but then more of a long taproot down in deeper depths, so it can access medium depth soil and water resources. It has more water early in the growing season. It can photosynthesize at low water availability as well, but not to the extent that the bristly foxtail here can. And then finally, we have smartwheat. So smartwheat has this very, very long taproot that you can see. It's moderately branched up near the surface, but then has a taproot that's really, really deep. It penetrates the deepest in the soil. That gives this plant a relatively continuous supply of moisture from deep soil. So you can imagine it's probably the one that is least well adapted to drought conditions and periodic droughts. If it had a shorter or less extensive root system. So this is an example of resource partitioning vertically, or vertical resource partitioning, where each of these different species is adapted to take advantage of a different resource in the same soil profile, and so they avoid competition with one another. All right. Resource partitioning is also seen in animals living in the same habitat and using similar resources. Small wild cats, for example, present throughout the Middle East. There's variation among species in the size of their canine teeth. There's a general size relationship between the size of the canine teeth and the preferred prey species. There's also sexual dimorphism in the species. So you have females who have canines that are generally larger than the canines of males, and that actually reflects intraspecific competition for resources, food, prey species. All right. So what you see here is that if you plot the difference in tooth sizes, it gives a very regular pattern with almost no overlap in terms of diameter of the canine teeth along the x-axis. And this suggests that selection has reduced the overlap of tooth size and thus the size of prey taken. So you can see very clearly you have the average canine size shown by the vertical line with probably a 95% confidence interval around that, and you see that there's almost no overlap. There's a little bit there, but really almost no overlap between them. And so this suggests that they are very finely adapted via the size of their canine teeth to take advantage of different prey species, and so they avoid competing with one another in that way. And again, natural selection favors the avoidance of competition. All right. Now, morphological, physiological, and behavioral changes are adaptations that allow resource partitioning among species that coexist with one another. We've seen various examples of that already here in part 3. But differences among species may also reflect adaptations that enable a species to use resources in an environment independent of competition. It could be that other selective forces have resulted in these adaptations besides just competition by itself. All right. So how can we study competition maybe that happened in the past with little information about who the competitors were or the resource availability that influenced that natural selection? One ecologist has referred to this hypothesis of resource partitioning as a product of coevolution between competitors as the ghosts of competition past. In other words, the resource partitioning that we see today between different species, like the cats, for example, is sort of a reflection of coevolution between competitors that happened in the past. Okay, evolution that resulted in them now ultimately utilizing different aspects of their resource pool. So the role of past competition cannot be directly observed, but we can see evidence of that in terms of the resource partitioning present today. So, is there a way to evaluate if it's happened in a population? Yes, there is. We can look at the difference in characteristics of subpopulations of a species that are in different competitive environments. For example, some really great evidence for this comes from the studies on the Galapagos Islands of Peter and Rosemary Grant. Remember, I mentioned earlier in the class that they did a lot of studies of the Galapagos ground finches. There are about 14 or 15 species of ground finches. And in two of the species that they've studied in particular, the medium ground finch, Geospiza fortis, and the small ground finch, Geospiza ferruginosa, they found very good evidence of past competition that has resulted in modern resource partitioning when the two species are found together. Turns out this resource partitioning is not present when these two species are found living in isolation on separate islands, and that's the key point. So these two species are found together on Santa Cruz Island. On that island, the distribution of beak sizes in the two species does not overlap. So here you see beak depth, okay, and here you see the distribution of beak sizes in one species, I believe that is ferruginosa, and this is in the other species, fortis. Hope I have that right. Yeah. Okay, but you see that there's no overlap between them, right? There's no overlap here at all, so this is suggesting that larger beak sizes are maybe adapted for one food source, smaller beak sizes adapted for another food source. But again, the important point is that both these species live on the same island. So maybe this is an example of past competition resulting in modern resource partitioning between these two species on the same island. Now, these two species also live separately on two islands. On Daphne Major, you find Geospiza fortis, and on the island of Los Hermanos, you find Geospiza ferruginosa. So these two species do live in isolation on two separate islands, and in those populations, the distribution of beak sizes in the two species actually does overlap. That's exactly what you see here. So this is the non-overlapping situation we saw when they lived together on the same island. Now, in Daphne Major, This is the distribution of beak sizes for Geospiza fortis, and on Los Hermanos, this is the distribution of beak sizes for G. ferruginosa. You can see there's quite a bit of overlap between them, right? And so the mean on Santa Cruz for G. fortis is shifted to the right. The mean of G. ferruginosa, easy for me to say, on Santa Cruz is shifted to the left compared to where either of them are on the islands of Daphne Major and Los Hermanos. So no competition here, no competition here. When they're on the same islands, you see they spread apart and you get lack of overlap between them. So the question is, what does this suggest about natural selection and beak size in the populations that live together versus those that live separately? Well, on Santa Cruz, where the two species coexist, right? So on Santa Cruz Island, when they coexist, there's competition for food, and the food is seeds. Natural selections favor G. fortis individuals with larger beaks, right here, that can handle and eat larger seeds. It's also favored G. ferruginosa individuals with smaller beaks that can handle and eat smaller seeds. So the outcome of competition has been a shift then in their feeding niches through a change in beak size in each species. That again is resource partitioning, okay? That's what's causing this. But in particular, the shift in the mean beak size that we see is what's called character displacement. All right, character displacement. So character displacement then is this shift in a morphological, behavioral, or a physiological character as a result of niche partitioning due to competition. Okay, so we've seen then in this chapter that competition is a complex interaction. It seldom involves two species interacting for a single resource. It involves a variety of environmental factors that vary in both time and space, and the outcome under one set of environmental conditions can be very, very different than the outcome under a different set of environmental conditions. So it's a competition is a result of a complex web of interactions through all these different variables and competing forces, basically. And lots of studies are looking at, the ways in which these different interactions can affect things like character displacement and all sorts of things like that. It's very complex. Okay, so that wraps up the third part of the video lecture for Chapter 13, and we are now done with Chapter 13.